Hello, I'm William Sanchez, and this is the Philosophical Rebellion Substack. Today, I'm going to talk about the fourth section of my book on the origin of COVID-19. At the start of this pandemic, I totally trusted the experts, thinking that they were sincerely interested in finding out how the pandemic began in order to prevent the next one. Because millions of people died from the COVID-19 pandemic, and tens of millions more were negatively impacted. But the reality is that the experts who were leading the pandemic origin investigation were actually engaged in the biggest scientific scandal of my lifetime. Those scientists engaged in the worst corruption of the scientific process I have ever seen. So, the narrative in 2020 was actually set by two scientific papers, the Lancet letter and Nature Medicine's Proximal Origins. In Proximal Origins, the scientists who published said that we do not believe any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible as the origin of COVID-19. And in the Lancet letter, the lab leak origin theory for COVID-19 was derided as a conspiracy theory absent evidence. So those two papers set the narrative in 2020, and the mainstream media really ran with it. NPR published that there is virtually no chance that the new coronavirus was released as a result of a laboratory accident in China or anywhere else. Anthony Fauci then said, the scientific evidence is very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated. Everything about the stepwise evolution over time strongly indicates that this virus evolved in nature and then jumped species. And PolitiFact even fact-checked the claim that the virus could have emerged from a lab by saying, the genetic structure of the novel coronavirus, which has been shared by thousands of scientists worldwide, rules out the possibility that it was manipulated in a lab. Public health authorities have repeatedly said the virus was not created in a lab. The claim is inaccurate and ridiculous. We rate it pants on fire. And that false narrative was completely dominant for the first 2 years of the origin investigation into how COVID-19 started, with all eyes on the possibility of a natural origin, and the idea of a lab leak was still vilified and stigmatized as dangerous anti-science. So the Lancet Covid Commission issued an addendum, and that came from the Lancet Covid Commission kicking off members of that commission because they had undisclosed conflicts of interest. And because of those conflicts of interest, they were attempting to unscientifically dismiss and stigmatize the idea of a lab leak in order to prevent an honest investigation into how the pandemic started. So after Peter Daszak was kicked off of the Lancet Covid Commission, I wanted to ask him what happened. So I responded to a tweet by Christian Anderson in which Peter Daszak was also mentioned. They claimed that there was absolutely no evidence at all indicating a lab leak origin of COVID-19. So my tweet said, on the other side, you have the United States Senate, the United States intelligence community, and the Lancet Covid Commission all agreeing that the lab leak is the most likely origin of the pandemic, which would be very weird had there actually been no evidence of it. And Peter Daszak replied to me, saying, it is called politics, a field of work where nothing actually needs to be true for it to be useful. So I asked Peter Daszak, is it true that you were recruited to the COVID Commission by Jeffrey Sachs, then misled the commission until it was disclosed that you had undisclosed conflicts of interest motivating his unscientific denial of a lab leak, and then he left rather than disclosing his conflicts of interest? He then replied, no, that is politics, not facts. So I asked, exactly which claim is untrue? Because if any of what Jeffrey Sachs said is true, it appears as though you orchestrated disinformation to mislead the scientific community regarding the potential likelihood of a lab leak origin. I was then blocked by Peter Daszak, which really felt like I was exposing the truth that he lied to the Lancet Covid Commission, was kicked off that commission in disgrace, and then was continuing to lie about the evidence indicating a possible lab leak origin of COVID-19. But what was clear at the time was that the Lancet Covid Commission corrected the false narrative of a proven natural origin and instead encouraged robust investigations into both the natural origin hypothesis and the lab leak hypothesis, with the chair of the Lancet Covid Commission coming out in 2022 saying, "I'm pretty convinced it came out of US lab biotechnology, not out of nature." And that had a lot to do with the research being conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the unsafe conditions that research was being done in. And it turned out that Peter Daszak was a major funder of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, with Peter Daszak receiving National Institute of Health grants from the United States government, which would then be subcontracted out to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to do coronavirus gain-of-function research, including collecting one of the world's largest repositories of coronaviruses and creating chimeras, which is the combination of multiple different parts of other viruses into a new, previously unseen virus. And they also conducted transgenic mouse model experiments with coronaviruses, meaning they would give a generation of mice a coronavirus found in nature, then take the mouse with the worst health and infect a new generation of mice with the new virus, and do that over and over and over and over again until you eventually come up with a much more dangerous virus than was initially introduced to those mice. And the most troubling part of all of that research was it was done in a BSL-2 level of biosafety, meaning it's like the safety of a normal dentist office, which is not enough to prevent the spread of a coronavirus, like what started the COVID-19 pandemic. So we had very good reason in 2022 to believe that a lab leak origin of COVID-19 was an equally plausible, if not more likely, origin for the COVID-19 pandemic. And since 2022, the scientific consensus has very clearly been the need for more investigations into all plausible origin pathways. But it became a very partisan issue, with Republicans leading the charge to investigate all origin pathways, and Democrats refusing to engage in the scientific process, calling it dangerous anti-science. So in October 2022, Republican Senator Richard Burr created the Analysis of the Origin of the COVID-19 Pandemic Interim Report, where he summarized the hypothesized natural origin evidence alongside the hypothesized lab leak evidence, in which he eventually asserted that a research-related incident was the most likely origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was based on 3 types of evidence: the historical precedent, an analysis of the research done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the lack of success in the investigation into a natural origin. So, first of all, Senator Richard Burr noted that in the original SARS outbreak, which was a natural pandemic in the early 2000s, laboratories which ended up studying that natural virus ended up accidentally releasing the same virus at least 6 separate times. And in 1977, there was also an influenza pandemic attributed to a research-related incident. There are actually examples of lab accidents leading to the unintentional release of smallpox, anthrax, cowpox, Ebola, Zika, West Nile viruses, and many more. Even in 2015, USA Today conducted an in-depth investigative report that documented hundreds of lab mistakes, safety violations, and near-miss incidents. In that report, USA Today analyzed a 7-year period in which they found vials of bioterror bacteria had gone missing, lab mice infected with deadly viruses had escaped, wild rodents had been found making nests with research waste, cattle infected in a university's vaccine experiment were then sent to slaughter and their meat sold for human consumption, and gear meant to protect lab workers from lethal viruses had failed repeatedly. In that study, analyzing records from 2006 to 2013, more than 1,500 incidents had been reported involving events ranging from spills to failure of personal protective equipment to mechanical failures to needle sticks and animal bites. There were even terrorist attacks using anthrax stolen from a CDC biological research facility. Actually, the extensive evidence of biosafety lapses was so severe that there was widespread debate in the scientific community regarding the need to restrict that type of research. So in 2012, in response to that ongoing debate, Anthony Fauci said that he worried about unregulated laboratories outside of the United States doing work sloppily and leading to an inadvertent pandemic. Fauci said, "Accidental release is what the world is really worried about." And in 2014, the Obama administration Office of Science and Technology actually banned gain-of-function research, with their direct quote saying, "The United States government will institute a pause on funding for any new studies that include certain gain-of-function experiments involving influenza, SARS, and MERS viruses." Specifically, the funding pause will apply to gain-of-function research projects that may be reasonably anticipated to confer attributes to influenza, MERS, or SARS viruses such that the virus would have enhanced pathogenicity and/or transmissibility in mammals via the respiratory route. So that type of research was so dangerous that the United States government actually banned its funding by United States government agencies like the National Institute of Health. Unfortunately, funding was still sent from the NIH to EcoHealth Alliance, which was then subcontracted out to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they were conducting gain-of-function research experiments with coronaviruses. And that research being conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the second line of evidence that Senator Richard Burr analyzed. So on page 261 of my book, I summarized what Richard Burr found. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was the world's foremost coronavirus research facility, and every year since 2004, scientists traveled thousands of miles away from that institute in order to collect natural bat viruses and then bring them back to that institute for study, meaning that the WIV had one of the largest collections of natural bat viruses in the world, including more than 15,000 samples taken from bats, over 1,400 bat viruses identified, and an estimated 100 strains from the same family as SARS-CoV-2 in their possession before the pandemic began, with the vast majority of those viruses previously undisclosed. Which was troubling because researchers at the WIV had made clear that they intended to seek out a human-adapted SARS virus or create one if they could not find one. And EcoHealth Alliance had submitted a DARPA grant proposal saying that they intended to insert a furin cleavage site into a SARS virus in order to create human-adapted SARS viruses. And it is assumed that the furin cleavage site in the SARS-CoV-2 virus is what enabled the virus to become so widely transmissible. So at that point, the investigation knew of an extremely extensive history of lab accidents leading to the unintentional release of dangerous pathogens. And that was combined with the knowledge that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting gain-of-function research with SARS viruses in too low of biosafety to keep the viruses contained. But one of the key pieces of evidence which heavily favored the lab leak origin hypothesis over a natural origin was the failure in the search for a possible natural origin of the pandemic. So, as the Lancet Covid Commission explained, more than 80,000 animal-related samples had been tested in the search for the natural origin. Yet, after 80,000 animal-related samples were tested, no natural origin had been found. And although the Huanan seafood market had been named as the epicenter of the initial outbreak, Senator Richard Burr noted that none of the animals at the market when it was closed, in the market's supply chain, or in China's animal farming industry were infected with SARS-CoV-2, which differed dramatically from the historical precedent set in the first SARS pandemic, in which there were multiple independent spillover events located. So instead of multiple independent spillover sites, with the virus slowly adapting to human transmission after being transmitted from the initial host species, the virus which caused COVID-19 only appeared in the human population once, fully adapted for human-to-human transmission. So at the end of 2022, after an extremely extensive search for a natural origin of COVID-19, none had been found. Alternatively, the evidence for a research-related origin of COVID-19 was conclusive enough for Senator Richard Burr to say that that was the most likely origin of the pandemic. And the Lancet Covid Commission clearly stated the scientific consensus. No independent, transparent, and science-based investigation has been carried out regarding the bioengineering of SARS-like viruses that was underway before the outbreak of COVID-19. The laboratory notebooks, databases, email records, and samples of institutions involved in such research have not been made available to independent researchers. Independent researchers have not yet investigated the U.S. laboratories engaged in the laboratory manipulation of SARS-like viruses, nor have they investigated the details of the laboratory research underway in Wuhan. In brief, there are many potential proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2, but there's still a shortfall of independent, scientific, and collaborative work on the issue. The search for the origins of the virus requires unbiased, independent, transparent, and rigorous work supported by all governments. And sadly, that's where a lot of partisanship came into the issue. And that mostly surrounded the legacy of Anthony Fauci, because it came out that despite the Obama-era moratorium on gain-of-function research, that Anthony Fauci actually funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in violation of the law. Then he committed perjury in the attempt to cover up that fact. NIH officials had actually paused funding going to the EcoHealth Alliance and then subcontracted out to the Wuhan Institute of Virology as gain-of-function research subjected to the pause. But for some reason, after communications between NIH officials and the EcoHealth Alliance head Peter Daszak, that gain-of-function research pause was lifted. So Senator Rand Paul asked Anthony Fauci why gain-of-function research was funded at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to which Fauci replied, "The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology." So then Rand Paul reiterated, "Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?" Then Fauci committed perjury for a second time, saying that the paper was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain-of-function research. That being, despite the fact that the research was initially flagged as gain-of-function and paused until an NIH official overturned that decision. So Senator Rand Paul asked Fauci, "You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans. You are saying that's not gain-of-function?" To which Fauci replied, "That is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you're talking about, quite frankly. I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about." Fauci was asked, taking an animal virus and increasing its transmissibility to humans, is that gain-of-function? And he said no, under oath, to Congress. And the official definition of gain-of-function research under United States law was research that may be reasonably anticipated to confer attributes such that the virus would have enhanced pathogenicity and or transmissibility in mammals. So that is an incredibly clear-cut case of perjury. But that deception did not completely stop the origin investigation from progressing. The United States Congress unanimously passed the COVID Origins Act, which was then signed into law by Joe Biden, meaning the entire elected government of the United States unanimously passed the COVID Origins Act, And that law demanded that the Director of National Intelligence release all classified information that the United States intelligence community possessed about how COVID-19 started. The report specifically asked for any researcher we know of from the WIV who was sick in 2019 with COVID-like symptoms. We want to know the researcher's name, the researcher's symptoms, the date of onset of the researcher's symptoms, the researcher's role at the WIV, and whether or not that researcher was involved with or exposed to coronavirus research. And weeks before the declassification deadline, the Wall Street Journal and the public Substack both came out with reports based on current and former government officials naming patient zero of the entire pandemic from the WIV gain-of-function research laboratories, meaning that a natural origin had not been located at all after an extremely extensive search into a possible natural origin of the pandemic. But patient zero was identified from the WIV after a much shorter and less thorough investigation into the hypothesized lab leak origin of COVID. But unfortunately, when the declassification deadline for the COVID Origins Act was finally here, the Director of National Intelligence disobeyed that law and refused to disclose any of the information that could have corroborated who patient zero was. The Director of National Intelligence disobeyed a direct order from the entire elected government of the United States, and the Director of National Intelligence is still, to this day, in violation of the law. A law designed to prevent future pandemics using the scientific method, which means we need transparency regarding all evidence we currently possess about how the last one started. So there's no greater dereliction of duty for a United States intelligence community member to engage in than withholding evidence which could help prevent the deaths of tens of thousands, if not millions, of Americans. And I think it is truly disgraceful that that information is being kept secret in violation of the COVID Origins Act. So, my proposed solution to how to get the information into the public is a congressional hearing where members of Congress subpoena the Director of National Intelligence and heads of the FBI and Department of Energy and CIA to ask them every single question of the COVID Origins Act. Because that's the way science works. We need transparency so we can have all of the evidence to make the most accurate, well-informed assessment of the situation possible. And until the law is actually obeyed, we cannot do that. So that brings us to where we are right now in the origin of COVID-19 investigation. And there are two main origin hypotheses which have been investigated: natural origin versus a lab leak origin. In the natural origin investigation, tens of thousands of animal-related samples have been tested from the Huanan seafood market, from its supply chain, and the entire livestock industry in China, with absolutely no natural origin found. Alternatively, in the lab leak investigation, we have reporting of patient zero from the Wuhan Institute of Virology gain-of-function research laboratories, with the main obstacle to total confirmation being the Director of National Intelligence refusing to obey the law. So at this point, a lab leak origin of COVID-19 is significantly more likely than a natural origin. So what would that mean if COVID-19 actually came out of a laboratory? Well, it would mean that we need extremely strict regulations on the type of research that could have led to this pandemic to begin with. And that research comes in different parts. It's the collecting of viruses, the storage of viruses, the guided evolution of viruses in transgenic mouse model experiments, and the creation of chimeras. And what should be painfully obvious is that this type of research should only be done in the highest of biosafety settings and in extremely remote locations. So when these viruses do escape from the laboratory, it is not in the middle of a densely populated city. But these very common sense measures increase the burden on virologists to do this type of dangerous research. So they are not only fighting against regulations, they are also fighting against an honest and open and transparent investigation into how the pandemic actually started. And that's where we are in the origin investigation. The scientific process is being horribly corrupted by virologists who don't want to know how the pandemic started because it might make their work a little bit more difficult and burdensome. So, really, ask yourself, is the dangerous anti-science coming from the people pushing for a thorough and transparent investigation into all possible research-related origins? Or is the dangerous anti-science coming from the people who would rather risk another pandemic rather than accept slightly more difficult regulations on the dangerous research they do? So that is the origin of COVID-19 section from my book, The Stories They Don't Want You to Know. If you want to check out the full progression of what I wrote and my views on this topic, check out my book available on Amazon.